Mrs. Parker was the daughter of a butcher. She was a strong woman who could keep things to herself and was very determined. She married her father's assistant and opened a butcher shop near Spring Gardens. But as soon as her father passed away, Mr. Parker started behaving badly. He drank too much, stole money from the cash register, and got deeply into debt. Trying to get Mr. Parker to promise to stop his bad habits didn't work. He always went back to his old ways a few days later. He argued with his wife in front of customers and bought low-quality meat, which ruined their business. One night, he even threatened his wife with a cleaver, so she had to go stay at a neighbor's house for safety. After that, they lived apart. She went to the priest and got a separation from him, along with her children's custody. She didn't give him money, food, or a place to stay, so he had to join the sheriff's team. He spent all day sitting in the bailiff's office, waiting for work. Meanwhile, Mrs. Parker, who had taken her remaining money from the butcher business, started a boarding house on Fleet Street. She was an impressive woman. Many different people visited her house, including tourists from Liverpool and Oxford, and sometimes performers from music halls. The people who stayed there for a long time were office workers from the city. She ran the house well, knowing when to be nice, when to be strict, and when to ignore small problems. The young men who lived there called her the Madam. Mrs. Parker's young men paid 12 gold coins a week for food and a place to stay. They had similar interests and jobs, so they were good friends. James Parker, Mrs. Parker's son, worked as a clerk for a commission agent in Hardwick Street. People thought he was tough. He liked using bad words like soldiers do, and he usually came home very late at night. When he met his friends, he always had a funny story to tell. He was also good at boxing and sang funny songs. On Friday nights, they would often have a get-together in Mrs. Parker's living room. Singers from the music hall would perform, and James played lively music. Mrs. Parker's daughter, Chloe, also sang. Chloe was 19 years old. She was slim and had black hair. Mrs. Parker had initially sent her daughter to work as a typist at the newspaper office. But ever since a shady young man started coming to the office every day, asking to speak to his daughter, Mrs. Parker brought Chloe back home and made her do housework instead. Since Chloe was very lively, she wanted to socialize with young men. Young men like having young women around. Chloe flirted with them, but Mrs. Parker, who was clever at judging people, knew that the young men were just having fun and were not serious about anything. This continued for a while, and Mrs. Parker started thinking about sending Chloe back to typing work. However, she noticed that something was happening between Chloe and one of the young men. She observed them closely, but didn't say anything. Chloe knew that her mother was watching her, and her mother's silence was clear. There was no open agreement or understanding between them. Even though people in the house began to talk about it, Mrs. Parker didn't get involved. Chloe's behavior started to become a bit strange. The young man was worried. Finally, when Mrs. Parker felt it was the right time, she stepped in. She handled issues decisively, like a butcher cutting meat, and in this situation, she had already made her decision. It was a bright Sunday morning. All the windows in the boarding house were open. Breakfast was over in the boarding house, and the breakfast table was full of plates with leftover bits of eggs and sausages. Mrs. Parker sat on the armchair and watched Molly clean the table. Molly was Mrs. Parker's servant. She asked Molly to collect the crusts and pieces of leftover bread to make bread pudding the next day. Once the table was cleaned and everything put away safely, Mrs. Parker began to think about the conversation she had with Chloe the night before. Everything turned out as she expected. She had asked direct questions, and Chloe had given honest answers. They both felt somewhat awkward, of course. Mrs. Parker felt awkward because she didn't want to seem too casual when hearing the news, nor did she want to appear as if she had planned things out. Chloe felt awkward because she didn't want anyone to think that she had figured out what her mother was silently allowing her to do. Mrs. Parker looked at the small clock on the fireplace. It was 6 minutes past 11. She had enough time to talk to Mr. Milton and then go to Fleet Street before noon. She was confident she would succeed. Many people agreed with her because she was a mother who felt unfairly treated. She had allowed him to stay in her house, thinking he was a good person, but he had taken advantage of her kindness. He was around 34 or 35 years old. He couldn't excuse his behavior, and he wasn't ignorant because he had experience. He had simply taken advantage of Chloe's lack of experience. The big question was, how would he make things right? In such situations, there needs to be a way to make things right. It's easy for the man. He can just move on like nothing happened after enjoying himself. But the girl suffers the most. Some mothers might accept money to settle such matters. She had heard of cases like that. But she wouldn't do that. The only way to make up for the loss of her daughter's honor was marriage. She checked all her options again before sending Molly to Milton's room to tell him she wanted to speak to him. She was confident she would succeed. Mr. Milton was a serious young man, not loud like others. She didn't think he would want a public scandal. Everyone in the house knew something about the situation, and there were rumors going around. Plus, he had worked for 15 years at a big corn merchant's office, and a scandal could mean losing his job. But if he agreed, everything might turn out well. She knew he had a good income, and she suspected he had some savings too. She stood up and looked at herself in the mirror. She was happy with the determined look on her face. She thought about mothers who struggled to manage their daughters. Mr. Milton was very anxious this Sunday morning. He had tried to shave twice, but his hand was so shaky that he had to stop. The memory of his confession from the night before was causing him a lot of stress. The priest had gone over every embarrassing detail of the situation, making his guilt even worse. At this point, he was almost grateful for the chance to make things right. The damage was already done. What choice did he have now but to marry her or leave? He couldn't ignore it and pretend everything was okay. People would talk about the affair, and his boss would soon find out. Dublin is a small place. Everyone knows everyone else's business. He felt pain in his chest as he imagined hearing his boss, Mr. Simeon, calling for him in his harsh voice.
Please send Mr. Milton here.
All those years of hard work gone for nothing. All his effort and dedication gone. When he was younger, he had been careless and rebellious, denying God's existence in pubs. But that was all in the past. Almost. He still bought a newspaper every week, but he was now focused on his religious duties and lived a disciplined life for most of the year. He had enough money to settle down. That wasn't the issue. His family would not approve of her. Chloe's father had a bad reputation, and her mother's boarding house was becoming known for the wrong reasons. He felt like he was being tricked. He could imagine his friends talking and making fun of the situation. She was a bit vulgar sometimes. She would say things like, "I seen," and "if I had have known." But did grammar really matter if he truly loved her? He couldn't decide whether to like her or be angry at her for what she had done. Of course, he had done it too. His gut feeling told him to stay single, not to marry. It said that once you're married, you're trapped. While he sat on the bed, feeling helpless in his shirt and trousers, she knocked on his door and went in. She confessed everything, telling him that she had told her mother everything, and her mother would speak to him. She cried and hugged him, saying,
"Milton, what should I do? I don't know what to do."
She said she would end her own life. He tried to comfort her, telling her not to cry, that everything would be okay. There was no need to worry. He could feel her heart beating against his shirt. It wasn't entirely his fault that it happened. He was someone who hadn't been in many romantic situations. On nights when he came home very late, she would heat up his dinner for him. He hardly paid attention to what he was eating because he felt her presence beside him, alone at night in the quiet house. And she was so considerate. If the night was chilly, rainy, or windy, she always had a small cup of hot chocolate waiting for him. Perhaps they could be happy together. They would quietly go upstairs together, each holding a candle, and when they reached the 4th floor, they would say goodnight reluctantly. He remembered her eyes and how he felt overwhelmed with excitement when he was with her. But the excitement fades. He repeated her words asking himself the same question.
What should I do?
His instinct, as someone unmarried, told him to be cautious. He knew he had to make things right after such a mistake. While he was sitting with Chloe on the bed, Molly came to the door and said that Mrs. Parker wanted to see him in the living room. He stood up to put on his coat and vest, feeling more helpless than ever. When he was dressed, he went over to Chloe to comfort her. Milton told her that everything would be okay. There was no need to worry. He left her crying on the bed. As he went down the stairs, his glasses fogged up so much that he had to take them off and clean them. He wished he could fly through the roof and go to a place where he wouldn't have to deal with his problems anymore. On the last set of stairs, he passed James Parker, who was coming up from the pantry carrying 2 packets of nachos. They greeted each other coldly. Milton looked at James's strong arms and thick face. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he looked up and saw James looking at him. Suddenly, he remembered a night when one of the music hall performers, a blonde person from London, made a rude comment about Chloe. The gathering almost turned chaotic as James got angry. Everyone tried to calm James down. The performer got scared and said it was just a joke. But James kept yelling at him, threatening that if anyone dared to do something like that to his sister again, he would fight them. Chloe sat on her bed, crying. Then she wiped her tears and walked to the mirror. She looked at herself from the side and put a hairpin above her ear. After that, she went back to her bed and lied down. She looked at the pillows for a long time, since they brought back pleasant memories. She leaned her head against the headboard and began to daydream. She didn't look worried anymore. She waited patiently, almost cheerfully, without feeling anxious. Her memories slowly faded away, replaced by hopes and dreams about the future. She was so lost in her thoughts that she forgot about the fact that she was waiting for something. Finally, she heard her mother calling her. She quickly got up and ran downstairs.
Chloe, Chloe.
Yes, Mother?
My dear Chloe, Mr. Milton wants to speak to you.
Then she remembered what she had been waiting for.